One last research method we'll just briefly touch on is secondary data analysis. So this involves analyzing data or information that was previously collected. So we don't always need to collect our own data. If there's other researchers out there that have collected data from a really large sample, maybe a sample that represents the entire United States, for example, that would be very difficult for us as individuals to collect. But if there's a research organization like the US Bureau of Labor, for example, that has data about, every worker in the United States, we might just want to choose to analyze that data instead of collecting our own. So the pros of this is that it saves resources, obviously saves a lot of time, can save a lot of money when you don't have to collect your own data. And another big benefit of secondary data analysis is that it typically doesn't require IRB approval for you to research the secondary data. The institution or the researcher that collected it in the first place would have had to get IRB approval, but since they already did that when they collected the data, if this is a data set that's free and openly accessible to the public, you wouldn't need IRB approval to analyze that particular data set. Some cons with this, obviously, if you're not the one designing the survey instrument to collect that data, you can't ask whatever questions you'd like, so you're limited to whatever questions were asked in that particular survey. That's the data you have to work with. It also may be difficult to access and interpret. It's not always clear if you're not the one, again, designing the specific questions and organizing the survey instrument, you might not understand the meaning behind some of the questions that are being asked. So it could make your analysis a little limited in that way. So what research method might you use to test this hypothesis? Being a member of a fraternity or sorority will result in higher alcohol consumption. Based off the methods we just talked about, so surveys, interviews, field research, and secondary data analysis, which one would you propose to use if you were designing a study to test this hypothesis? So there's really no right or wrong answer to this question. Like I said before, choosing a research method really depends a lot on the individual conducting the study. So if we chose to use a survey to collect our data, a benefit of that might be that we could access the perspectives of a lot of college students in a fairly little bit of time, right? However, maybe we'd want to do interviews because maybe we're more interested in understanding the motivations behind what causes a college student to drink, specifically if they're a member of a fraternity or a sorority. We also might suggest doing participant observation for this, or non-participant observation, right? Maybe we decide we're just going to go to a frat party one night and watch how much people drink because we think people might lie to us about the number of alcoholic beverages they drink if we ask them that in a survey or in an interview. So watching their behaviors might be the best way to get valid data for this particular project. But let's just say, for example, that we chose to do a survey. What questions would we want to ask to test this hypothesis? So again, in this particular hypothesis, our independent variable, the variable that we're expecting is going to cause a change in the dependent variable, would be membership in a fraternity or sorority, and our dependent variable would be alcohol consumption. So we would for sure need variables that ask whether or not the college student is in a fraternity or sorority. So it might be a survey question that asks that, and then we would also want a survey question asking how many alcoholic beverages they consume. So let's talk about how we would go about conducting a study and drawing conclusions building on this example of Greek life status and alcohol consumption. So we'd have to determine if we want to use a quantitative research approach or a qualitative research approach. Now, the difference between the two here is that quantitative research collects data that can be represented numerically. So maybe we ask, for example, how many alcoholic beverages do you consume in a week? Students would answer, anywhere from 0 to 100, however many that is, right? And then we would also ask questions about, are you in Greek life? Yes or no. Now, yes or no might not seem like it can be represented numerically, but we could code those responses. So yes means 1 and no means 2. And what happens when we are able to represent data numerically like that is that it allows us to conduct statistical analyses. Now, we're not going to go deep into statistics here in this class, But there are definitely more stats courses for you to take, and as a social researcher, being able to conduct statistics does become a pretty important aspect of our careers. We'll talk just about some baseline descriptive statistics like calculating the mean or the average, and we'll use that and the percentages to compare and contrast some hypothetical data that we'll look at in a bit here. So qualitative research, on the other hand, is exploratory, and it's used to analyze textual data, so data that cannot be numerically represented, right? So it involves often in-depth interviewing, right, where we're maybe not interested in determining if there's a statistically significant correlation between two variables. We're just more interested in that exploratory research. So we want to better understand themes that maybe develop across participants. Like I said, if we wanted to interview college students to better understand what motivated them to drink, we might discover some themes through our interviews. We might see that individuals who came from single parent households were more likely to drink than individuals from two parent households. Maybe we'd see that that individuals who are white were more likely to drink than individuals who were people of color. And those would be themes that we would maybe generate through having this type of conversational analysis through interviews. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about these methods here, but just know that quantitative research is, again, striving to make objective claims, typically that can be generalized to larger populations through the analysis of numerical data. Qualitative research is far more exploratory, interested in answering those open-ended who, what, why questions through thematic analysis of textual data. When it comes to analyzing data, quantitative analysis typically involves the use of statistics to test a hypothesis, like I said. In its simplest form, this could be calculating percentages or averages across groups. In more complex forms, however, statistical analysis involves measuring and predicting the strengths of relationships between multiple variables. So earlier I talked about that flawed study that thought there was a significant correlation between ice cream sales and murder rates in cities, but it was later found to be the heat that was actually the variable that caused a change in murder rates. So in that instance, heat would be the independent variable, murder rates would be the dependent variable. And the way researchers were able to determine that there was a significant relationship there is by running what's called a regression analysis. So we can determine if there is a statistically significant relationship between two variables using statistics. So that sounds probably pretty boring, but statistics are really powerful stuff, and that's how we get research that is of high enough quality to be published in scholarly journals. If we find there's a significant relationship between heat and murder rates, we can write an article about that and get our findings published in a scholarly source. Qualitative analysis takes a different approach. We're not doing statistics with qualitative analysis. We do something that's called coding, right? Which is essentially just reading through every line of an interview transcript and generating and kind of labeling the data, organizing the data into different categories, and then looking for common themes across the different participants or members of the sample that you're studying. So in my last project, I interviewed over 40 married people, and I was really interested in extracting themes about marriage, specifically themes for people that identified as part of the LGBT plus community and were married. So I read through every line of 41 interview transcripts, which were several pages in length. Each of my interviews was over an hour long, and so typed out over an hour of conversation ended up being typically about 20 single-space pages of text. So I had hundreds of pages of text that I was reading through, and I was trying to kind of almost put together this puzzle. I was finding common themes that stood out across my 41 participants, and that process allowed me to generate qualitative data. It was a qualitative analysis of this text of these interview transcripts. Coding allows researchers to track and produce themes, and quantitative analysis, on the other hand, relies on statistics to determine whether or not there are significant relationships between variables. So qualitative analysis, typically used to address our research questions, which are exploratory and open-ended. Quantitative analysis, typically used to test our hypotheses, which are those predictive statements between two variables. So an example of a research approach, let's say the hypothesis that we've been working with this whole time amongst college students being a member of a fraternity or sorority will result in higher alcohol consumption. Our independent variable that we're working with is membership in fraternity or sorority. Our dependent variable is alcohol consumption. The population, so the large group that we're trying to say something about, would be college students and fraternities and sororities. A sample, the smaller, more manageable group that we're going to collect data from for our study, will focus on members of fraternities and sororities here at TAM-UCC. Now, why would we also want to include TAM-UCC students who are not in fraternities and sororities in our sample? So why would we also want to survey college students at TAM-UCC that aren't in fraternities and sororities to gauge their alcohol consumption? Well, we'd want to do that so we could have a group to make comparisons against, right? If we just asked members of fraternities and sororities how many alcoholic beverages they consume, and we get those numbers, we collect that data, we're not going to be able to determine whether or not it's significantly higher or significantly lower than college students who aren't in fraternities and sororities if we don't also collect data from that group as well. So an important thing to think about when you're collecting data, just because you're interested in a particular population doesn't mean that that's the only group of people that you want to collect data from. Sometimes we want a group to make comparisons with, so our findings can really be more significant and more pronounced. The method of data collection for this example, let's say we're going to conduct a survey, so we'll send out a survey to some students. So the type of data we're working with would be numerical then rather than textual data. And the analysis, we are going to be conducting some quantitative analyses using statistics in this example. The survey example, so let's say this is the survey questions that we set out to ask. Are you a member of a fraternity or sorority, which would be a yes or no question. On average, how many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical week? We'll let people write in the number for that question. And then just to add another variable here, let's also ask participants' gender. So what gender do you identify with? And for this response, I included man, woman, non-binary for individuals who choose to identify beyond the binary. And also, and this is an ethical consideration to make, gender is continuously becoming recognized as a spectrum rather than just a closed category system. So there might be people that identify with a gender that's not listed here. For example, a lot of Native American tribes have a gender category called Two-Spirit. Some people might choose to identify as gender queer or gender fluid. People might want to be recognized as being a transgender man or a transgender woman. So I'll always leave an open-ended question with a lot of these demographic variables just so people have the ability to write in their responses if they don't feel represented by one of the categories provided here. So let's say this is hypothetical data. I made this up. This isn't real factual data that I collected from TAM-UCC students. But let's just say that this is the data I collected from 11 participants here. So I gave them all ID numbers. I didn't ask for their names. Again, a good ethical consideration. Here I have whether or not they're in a fraternity or sorority. This is the number of drinks each of them said they consumed in a week. And this is the gender of the 11 people I surveyed. Determining what data to analyze. So to determine what variables we'll need to analyze, we must look at our research question or our hypothesis, right? So our hypothesis, again, being in Greek life will result in higher alcohol consumption. So the variables we want to look at are Greek life and alcohol consumption. Research question, how does gender affect college students' alcohol consumption? So for this particular analysis, we'd want to be looking at both gender and alcohol. So it really depends on what variables you're addressing in your hypothesis and your research question to determine what you're going to analyze for this particular project. So let's say that this is the data that I found here. Participant ID on the left and number of drinks on the right. So I had a total of 11 participants, and in total, in 1 week, they consumed 64 beverages together. So the total number of alcoholic drinks consumed is 64. To calculate the mean, or the average number of drinks consumed per student in my sample, we would divide the total number of drinks consumed by all students in our sample, which was 64, by the number of participants in our sample, which is 11. So 64 divided by 11 would give us an average of 5.8 drinks consumed per week. So on average, a typical student in my sample would consume 5.8 drinks. This mean is a measure of central tendency, which is a fancy way of saying that it represents what is average or typical of our data or our sample. So I could say the average number of alcoholic drinks students consumed in our sample per week was 5.8. So this is the most basic of statistics, is calculating the mean or the average of a group. We could also go further to take a look at how Greek life versus students who are not in Greek life might affect our averages, right? So over here I have the 5 participants in our sample who are in Greek life, 5 of them. In total they consumed 40 drinks. 40 divided by 5 gives us an average of 8 drinks per student in Greek life. And over here we had 6 students who are not in Greek life, and they consumed a total of 24 drinks. So 24 divided by 6 gives us an average of 4 drinks. So based on these observations, what can we infer?